Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for Oysters and Mussels, a dynamic duo of bay restoration. We are pleased to have two experts with us today for both oyster and mussel restoration, and we will introduce them momentarily. A couple of housekeeping items. All participants are muted. At the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A box. If you would like to ask a question, we'd ask that you please type it in the Q&A box, and we will answer it during the question and answer portion of this webinar. We encourage you to ask as many questions as you like. We encourage that, so we will answer them as they come in. This webinar is being recorded. It is going to be posted on the Chesapeake Bay Program's YouTube page within 48 hours. So I am going to stop now and turn this over to Marisa Baldin, who will moderate today's session. Marisa is our Chesapeake Bay Program Communications Office staffer with the Chesapeake Research Consortium. Marisa?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're very excited to have all of you here, along with our speakers, Andrew and Jorge. So we're joining you. We're all from the Chesapeake Bay Program. And to give you a little background, the Bay Program is a federal state partnership working to restore the Chesapeake Bay watershed through science-based restoration. A critical element of our work is that we work throughout the entire watershed from New York to Virginia and West Virginia to Delaware with projects on the land and in freshwater and tidal rivers. Today, we're bringing attention to two of the bivalves that filter our waterways and provide countless other benefits to the ecosystem. Oysters are incredible filter feeders, and a single adult oyster can filter as much as 50 gallons of water per day. We only have about 1% of our historic oyster population in the Chesapeake Bay. Here at the Chesapeake Bay Program, we have a goal to restore native oyster habitat and populations in 10 tributaries by 2025. We've already restored 6 of the 10 identified tributaries, plus an extra tributary in the eastern branch of the Elizabeth River. The Bay Program does not have an official freshwater mussel restoration program, but in 2021, our Science and Technical Advisory Committee published a report highlighting the value of mussels to the Chesapeake Bay watershed restoration. A mussel can only filter 10 gallons of water in comparison to an oyster's 50 gallons, but unlike oysters, which you typically only find in Maryland and Virginia, freshwater mussels are found in all 7 jurisdictions of the watershed. Today, we're joined by Jorge Bogantes Morales, the Natural Resources Specialist from the Anacostia Watershed Society. Montero. Jorge Bogantes Montero from the Natural Resources Specialist from the Anacostia Watershed Society, and Andrew Button, Deputy Chief of the Shellfish Management Division and Head of Conservation and Replenishment with Virginia Marine Resources Commission. Today, these experts will share some information about bay restoration projects in different areas of the watershed. So we're going to follow the way of our waterways and start up in the Anacostia with Jorge talking about freshwater mussels, and then we'll move down to the bay and hear from Andrew Button about oyster restoration. So Jorge, we'd love for you to kick it off and tell us a little bit about your work.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me well. So yeah, I'm a natural resources specialist at the Anacostia Watershed Society. We are in DC in Maryland, in the nation's capital. The Anacostia River mostly flows through DC, but it's mostly a Maryland watershed, since more than 80% of the watershed is in Maryland. All right, so, okay, great, awesome. Thank you, Marisa and team. So I'm gonna be talking about MusselPower, our effort to propagate and restore freshwater mussels in the Anacostia River. Now, this work is mostly on the DC area because, again, most of the tidal main stem of the Anacostia is in DC, and because of permitting reason, we're focusing in DC. Okay, next slide, please. Why mussels? The Anacostia Watershed Society was founded in 1989, and we've been doing a lot of work education, restoration, recreation. So we spent a lot of time in the river. We started seeing mussel shells and mussels. We didn't know much about mussels, let's say a decade ago or even less. But we became more interested in the MusselPower. Next slide, please. We even started doing some submerged aquatic vegetation or underwater grass propagation. And within those PVC cages, we started seeing juvenile mussels and adult mussels. And so it was evident that, okay, we've got there's something going on here, and it's great. Mussels are still here even after decades of pollution and negligence. So we ought to take a deeper look at mussels. Next slide, please. First of all, many people ask, can you eat them? The short answer is yes. You don't want to eat them from the Anacostia river because of the pollution issues. I've never tasted them myself, but what I've heard from people that have tasted them is that they taste like mud. What you normally get at the grocery store or a restaurant are marine or brackish mussels. So these freshwater mussels, again, people say that they taste like mud. And again, many of them are imperiled and legally protected. So you don't want to eat them for a variety of reasons. Next slide. And many things aligned for us to start doing this. One of them being the Anacostia River Tunnel is the biggest construction since Metro in the city. So it's a huge tunnel. One is started working in 2018 and is cutting sewage by more than 88%, more than expected actually. And with that stormwater and sewage, thousands of tons of trash every year. Next slide, please. And also because other people are doing this work, we learn about the partnership for the Delaware estuary. They're doing awesome work with mussels, including with a very nice scientific component led by Danielle Krieger. So we got inspired by that. Next slide. And really what made it possible was our partnership with the Virginia Fisheries and Aquatic Wildlife Center, also known as the Harrison Lake National Fish Hatchery. Is a mussel hatchery. It used to be a fish hatchery, but it became a mussel hatchery only. And it's the biggest one in our greater region, Mid-Atlantic / South. And is run by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources. So I'll talk more about the process, but without the hatchery, we really couldn't do this because it's a complex process. Next slide, please. And other things have been improving, and including a very big one, which is water and water quality. Even though the data from last year made us grade the river with a failing grade, mostly because the acreage of submerged aquatic vegetation reduced a lot because of rainfall patterns and other things. But all in all, many variables are tending to improve, as you can see on the report card with the green arrow pointing up. A lot of things are improving, except for stormwater volumes. And I'll talk about the implications of that in mussel restoration. And why mussels? Because they are filter feeders, like the oysters. So they eat stuff suspended in the water column. They just filter a lot of water and assimilate what they consider nutritious, which could be protozoans, phytoplankton, E. coli, which can make us sick. And that's why you don't want to eat them from polluted waterways, and other microorganisms. They filter, like Marisa said, between 10 and 20 gallons of water a day. So less than the oysters, 50 gallons, but pretty decent, all things considered. especially once you consider a healthy mussel bed of hundreds or thousands of mussels. That's not a negligible biofiltration ecosystem service being provided. And this is a classical demo before and after. The tank on the left, these are 5-gallon tanks. The tank on the left has like 11 mussels, full-grown mussels, and the tank on the right doesn't have any mussels. So in the lower one was taken an hour later. You can basically see through. You can see through the background because it's nice and clear. And that's what they do. Mussels help settle the sediment so the water becomes clear. Next slide, please. And this is a very fascinating facet of mussels, their life cycle. These mussels, unlike oysters and other bivalves, they must have fish to complete their life cycle. They require a fish host. So the female, when she's ready, she will release the larvae, which are called glochidia, and the glochidia attached to a fish, which could be a fish from a specific family, or it could be different types of fish, or it could be even a single species. And then in the fish body, they live as parasitic, sort of like a tick or lice. We don't know that they don't transmit diseases as far as we know, but they are parasitic. They eat their tissues and bodily fluid for about a month. And then after that period, they drop down to the riverbed and become filter feeders as we know them. Next slide, please. So this is the very fascinating species, the eastern lamb mussel we have in the Anacostia River. And they have a lure to attract the host fish. In this case, the lure looks like a fake minnow. So when they are ready to release the larva, they bring out their mantle lure display and wiggle it. So when a largemouth bass, for example, comes and bites, the female releases the larva, and then the larva attached to the fish body. So it's a very nice mechanism of attracting the host fish. Next slide, please. So in 2015, we started doing an assessment with expert Matt Ashton, expert from the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. And this was the first assessment of its kind in the Anacostia River. People may have looked at mussels, even some collection from the Natural History Museum by the Smithsonian, but nothing was really looking at the mussel communities per se. So this was the first work of its kind, and we started understanding the mussels of the Anacostia rivers, particularly tidal Anacostia, where we focused. And not only in Maryland, it was actually Maryland and DC, even though it was performed by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. Next slide, please. So then we continue doing our own surveys at AWS with the help of staff, volunteers, interns, and such. Next slide. Okay, so these are some of the sites where we do the surveys. Kenilworth Lake, if you know DC, you may know Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens, which is here on the upper right. So this is sort of the riverside. It's Kenilworth Lake. It's not quite a lake, it's a tidal impoundment. Next photo shows Kingman Lake, which is another tidal impoundment, not quite a lake. And we have found that these places are refugia for mussels. Even after all these years of, and centuries really, of pollution, land use, and negligence, these tidal impoundments, because they are sort of sheltered, they have acted as refugia for mussels. Next photo, please. Yeah, Buzzard Point is right at the confluence with the Potomac River, and is so far is sort of our mussel hotspot. We have found the healthiest mussel community there at Buzzard Point. On both sides, we recently found another one across the river on the Joint Air Force Base site, which is very exciting. Next one. So yeah, so far we have identified 8 native freshwater mussel species in the Anacostia River. If you see the little SGCN icon, that means species of greatest conservation need. It could be either in Maryland or DC that they're listed as such. In most cases, the ranking overlaps. But again, 5 of the 8 are listed as in need of conservation. And that comes to show because mussels are the most imperiled group of animals in the US. About 70% of mussel species in America are either extinct, rare, threatened, or endangered. If you compare it to other groups of animals like birds or mammals, they only have about 10% of species that are rare, threatened, extinct, or endangered. So that makes mussels really the most imperiled group of animals in America. Next slide. So yeah, this is just the species richness by site. Again, we have found, like I've been saying, that the Bosser Point, Kenilworth, and Kingman, around Kingman Island as places with important mussel diversity. That's why we are protecting them, monitoring them to help understand them, but also we are augmenting, we're releasing mussels there. We're either culturing them in cages and then releasing them to multiply their populations and bring their biofiltration benefits. Next slide. And in the mussel surveys, now that we've been releasing mussels, we're finding mussels that we tag with shellfish tags, like this one, A261, that had grown 26% since it was released a year previously. So these are always great findings during our mussel surveys. Next slide. And the fact that they're reproducing is great. It might sound very basic, but in other places of the country, like the state of Oregon and in the Willamette River, there's nice mussel beds, but they are not reproducing, and it is not quite known why. Could be a number of reasons, including climate change related or others, or availability of host fish, but they are not reproducing. So the fact that the Anacostia River, which was a polluted river, I mean, it still has pollution, of course, but the fact that we have these populations that are reproducing is a great sign. Next slide. So we started mussel restoration. Actually, this month marks our 4th year of propagating mussels in the river. So we've been putting them in cages. We're monitoring their growth, survival. We're checking for which sites are better to grow mussels. We're helping in the conservation of the species. And we're also contributing to science by providing samples for a number of studies ranging from nutrient content in the tissues to microplastics and other things. And with the idea, more mussels, more biofiltration, cleaner water. Next slide. So the first phase from 2018 to 2019 was our first time we deployed over 40 baskets at 7 sites throughout the river. These floating baskets are normally used in ponds, but the Anacostia River is sluggish enough, it's tidal, so, and the fluctuation is very slow, so making the baskets suitable. We lost some here and there if there's like a crazy storm, but normally we don't lose many, so it's good for they work in the Anacostia River. Next slide. So this is how it works. I collect the brood stock. It could be in the fall or in the spring. So these are the gravid females. So you can see we carefully pry them open, and then if the gills are swollen, we know there is a gravid female, a pregnant female. So we take it to the hatchery, and then they propagate the juveniles for us. Next slide. So yeah, they have a number of growing systems indoors and outdoors in ponds. They do the host fish infestation and all that process at the hatchery, and then 6 months later they give us the juveniles, a fourth of an inch to half an inch long. Next slide. Yeah, you can skip through that. This is a map of the sites where we propagate them during the first phase. And this shows an LY floater, one of the species we're propagating. Mussels have a cool thing. They are like trees. They have growth rings. And in this case, you can see A marked growth ring. This marks the end of a growing season, winter. And then this area marked by the arrows is the growth during a growing season. You can see even a green color hue, a green hue there, very nicely showing the new growth of the mussel. This is a very fast growing species, so you can see that very easily. Next slide. And the second phase, 2019 to now, we have continued doing surveys and propagating mussels. Next slide. And a different size, but this time we're also using bottom cages. These are cinder block cages in the riverbed, which we have shown to be, mussels are growing better in these cages. Makes sense because it's in their microhabitat on the riverbed. Next slide. All in all, we have found a growth of an inch per year in general. Like LY floaters tend to be faster growers, pond mussels and land mussels a little slower growers. Some of the things we have observed during this monitoring. Next slide, please. We also, like I mentioned, we tag a sample of mussels when we release, either with a plastic shellfish tag in the upper mussel here, the B872, or with a pit tag that has a radio signal technology. Although we only did that for a specific sample just to test the technology because the hatchery has it. Next slide, please. So these are the species that we're propagating. So these are the main four that we're propagating, eastern floater being the most recent one we're propagating. We started with these three, LY floater, eastern land mussel, and eastern pond mussel. Next slide, please. Eastern elliptio. So eastern elliptio is the most recent. We haven't cultured or released any because they are still very tiny at the hatchery as we speak. This is very cool because this was produced in vitro. The host fish of the eastern elliptio is the American eel, but because eel are hard to culture in aquaculture, so they are using an in vitro solution to forego the eel. So this is a new technology that was started by a hatchery in Missouri. So we're excited to contribute to that. And as of last year, around 1,900 mussels were produced. You can see how tiny they were. In January, they were 4 millimeters long. So these are very slow growth species. But the cool thing is that they live up to 100 years. It's like the longest living species we know we have in the river. Next slide. And so far, after we have released over 30,000 mussels of 4 species into the Anacostia River. So once we culture the mussels in baskets or bottom cages for, let's say, a year, or sometimes we release the mussels straight from the hatchery if they are of suitable size, and then we release them into the river. Next slide. And education, we have MusselPower. First, we're sort of starting from scratch, telling people that we don't have oysters. This is a freshwater system. We have mussels, but we have more than one. We have 8 species, and they are filter feeders, and they are helping us clean the river, among other important ecosystem services. Next slide. We model this after the Ohio River Foundation program. We call it MusselPower, and it has a 3-part. It's a 3-part program, including classroom, field experience, and the boat tour. We engage approximately 700 students every season. Next slide. And the kids, so they get a whole kit, and they get a fish tank, they get mussels, like 20 mussels per classroom, and then they can raise them for a few months in the classroom, and then after that, they have an activity where they put them in our culturing system, like in the floating baskets. They get to measure them and all that, but they get to do other stuff like arts. This was this is a very cool piece by a kid saying that a fish is like a daycare for Glochidia. Remember that the Glochidia are the larvae that are parasitic on the fish. So it shows the gills and the larvae from hanging on to the gills. So pretty cool stuff. Next slide. And yeah, we're also working mostly with Prince George's County, Maryland, DC schools in Prince George's County, including kids from minority school systems and from underserved communities. So this is a good opportunity to engage a wider range of demographics in our area. Next slide. So the future, there's thousands of miles of streams and rivers in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and there's a lot of opportunities. And we have identified just in the tidal Anacostia River, 600 acres of places with potential for mussel release. Now, this only includes the tidal part of the river. It doesn't include the rest of the watershed. The problem with the rest of the watershed is, like I mentioned earlier, storm water, because we're in a very urban watershed. So a lot of impervious surfaces. So storm water, when it rains, it's very flashy. So those systems are not conducive to mussels. The reason why they have survived in the tidal Anacostia, even though all the centuries of pollution and negligence, is because it's a tidal environment, and tidal environments are very stable and compared to the non-tidal streams, which can get very crazy during storms, especially the kind of storm we get these days. But other than that, there's a lot of potential in rural areas and other areas to propagate mussels throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And I think that's all about MusselPower. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jorge. That was such a great overview of the work you're doing in the Anacostia River with our freshwater mussels. And we want to remind everyone to please use the Q&A function to add your questions. We're going to move on to Andrew Button's presentation about oysters in Virginia. But at the end, we'd love to get to everyone's questions, so please use that Q&A function. Andrew, take it away.
Great. Can you all hear me all right there? Okay. Well, I was going to go ahead and give a brief overview of sort of the oyster restoration history here in Virginia, and it largely mirrors what's been going on in Maryland, and sort of take you on a quick tour of the past so that we understand where we are in the present a little bit better here. And please feel free, as Marie said there, to think about questions, because I'd rather engage with folks and just sit here and talk to you. So with that in mind, I'll start running through here. So just as a little bit of background, this is the closest thing today that we have in Virginia, that picture in the background of what a sort of pre-colonial 400-year ago oyster reef might have looked like in the Chesapeake Bay. So this is actually a picture of the seaside eastern shore and an intertidal reef. So folks may have heard that, when Europeans were first starting to show up in the Chesapeake 400 some years ago, that oyster reefs were, a navigational hazard. So what you're looking at there is in about 3 feet of water, and it's covered at low tide. But in the Chesapeake Bay proper 400 or 500 years ago, you would have oyster reefs that look just like this at low tide, except instead of going down 3 or 4 feet to the bottom, they would go down 30 or 40 feet. So those reefs are gone today, primarily because of, as Jorge mentioned, that 400 years of deforestation, land misuse, population growth, all the things that have been going on in that 64,000 square mile watershed for such a long period of time. But I'm not sure that we'll ever be back to the way that things were 400 years ago, but we're doing our best to get there. Next slide, please. So again, I think Jorge had this map up there as well, but this is the watershed that we're working within, and we're sort of in that lower half there in Virginia. The Potomac River, which is a tributary there to the bay, is the Maryland-Virginia boundary, and right there, sort of in the center, where it branches off, the northwest branch is where Jorge was talking about, and everything that I'm talking about is taking place sort of further down the watershed in the Virginia portion of the bay and our tidal tributaries. But all that work that folks like Jorge and others are doing up the watershed really will hopefully have a positive benefit to oyster restoration. So if their work is more successful, it's likely going to lead to greater success in the work further down the watershed. Next slide, please. So first, I wanted to kind of, again, this is a little bit of a map heavy presentation, but I felt like it sort of grounds us of where we're talking about here. And this is a map depicting the public oyster ground in Virginia. So these are the locations that were mapped by J.B. Baylor in the 1890s that delineated and set aside all of the public oyster rocks in Virginia. So not every single piece of the ground or every single acre in these areas was all a continuous oyster reef like you saw in that first picture, but significant portions of this were. So there's over 250,000 acres just on the bay side here. And in the Virginia, we call the seaside eastern shore. So you have your bay side, which is Chesapeake Bay, and then the eastern shore seaside. So those are the areas that were set aside back then, and they still exist more or less unchanged, a little bit added to here and there, and a few pieces are moved today. But these are the areas where oysters still exist today, but where there used to be a lot more. Next slide, please. So in addition to that public oyster ground, as it's called in Virginia, we also have one of the oldest and most progressive private ground oyster leasing system. So there's an additional 130,000 acres of oyster bottom that is currently under leased by private individuals in the state of Virginia. So not a large scale amount of restoration work goes on these private leases. There is some small scale effort going on here, but there are a lot of oysters on these locations that are primarily harvested by private planters and growers and aquaculturists. Next slide, please. And again, this is sort of a composite view of the lower portion of the bay here. So that road you see going across is the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, and this is the Hampton Roads area here. And what you're looking at on this map in the sort of blue color is public oyster ground, that Baylor ground that was set aside. That sort of goldish yellow color is private oyster leases, and the green color are new applications. So you can see, even in these busy sort of urban areas like the Hampton Roads area, almost the entire James River is either public oyster ground or private oyster leases. So basically in Virginia, anywhere where oysters can exist is either already set aside as public oyster ground or has been leased by private planters. So there's a lot of bottom available for oysters here, and either it's set aside or public planters are at least attempting to propagate shellfish there. Next slide, please. So this will take you through, again, a little bit of that history that I mentioned, sort of going back to kind of when more modern fishery statistics began to be collected there in the 1880s. So folks often, I'm sure, hear about all of the overharvest that is the cause of the current state of the oysters. And this really is true going on from about sort of post-Civil War through about the 1930s there. So that's when you saw those millions of bushels being landed both in Maryland and Virginia. And then starting about in 1929 or 1930 or so is really when the replenishment program that Virginia still runs today, that I'm the head of, actually got started. And you can see that, at least according to harvest numbers, which were the best sort of method of sort of a proxy for our more scientific surveys today, you can see that really the oyster population and harvest numbers started to recover after that period of overharvest up through the 1960s, when you can really see that sudden downturn there. And that was primarily related to the introduction of two common oyster diseases, so MSX and dermo there. So, you know, the first 300 years was a result of population growth, clear cutting, agricultural practices that weren't as friendly to the earth as they are today, followed by that extensive overharvest. And then, you know, really since the 1930s, we've kind of got our harvest measures a little bit more under control. We're continuously putting oysters back into the water. But again, MSX disease, dermo, and sort of all of the bad things that have come into the watershed in the last 100 years haven't exactly helped things. But the good news is we're sort of on a little bit better trajectory today. Next slide, please. Again, a sort of shout out to the partnerships that the long-term federal partnerships that our predecessor agencies, NOAA's predecessor agency, the Department of Commerce, and the Virginia Bureau of Fisheries there, and the Marine Resources Commission have been partnering on oyster restoration for a long time. So what you're looking at here is a map of the public oyster grounds. And actually, again, as I mentioned, not everything in those big polygons is oyster rocks, but this is the bottom type and actual oyster rock further distinguished within those. So NOAA has been assisting the state with our mapping of oyster bottoms and our restoration efforts going all the way back to 1909. And this map, actually, the James River is, I'm looking at it now on my wall here. So we have a long history together there. Next slide, please. So again, you might recall back to that graph of harvest that I showed you there, and that really corresponds with sort of some key dates that you see right here. So 1928 was when the first repletion or restoration of public oyster rocks began. And that was really when we started to see a recovery in the oyster population, at least based on harvest numbers. You know, when you started to see that sudden downfall in the 50s and 60s, again, this was when MSX and Derma were really devastating oyster populations throughout the bay. So a typical oyster in good condition can live for 20 years or more, not quite as long as those 100-year-old mussels, but you know, they can live a lot longer than what we think of in our population today. But as a result of MSX and Dermo, many oysters in the 1960s weren't making it past 2 or 3 years old. So just when they were getting to marketable size and having a lot of shell base, they were dying of that disease. And that was when sort of, I would call it the second phase of large scale restoration took place with, again, our back before VMRC was VMRC and before NOAA was NOAA, starting really massive large scale oyster restoration in two of the areas that we're actually still working in today, the Piankatank and Great Wacomico. So millions of bushels of shell were planted as part of that early effort in the 1960s. And for reference, those baskets that you saw in Jorge's design, that's 1 bushel. So in 1 year alone, 2 million of those or more was being put over on the bottom in the 1960s by federal partners. And then again, sort of where you saw that tail of the long-term harvest data sort of bottom out was in the late 80s and early 1990s. And that happened to coincide with the first Bay Act agreement being signed in 1988. So those are sort of key points to take away, at least on the oyster timeline and where we've been in the past. Next slide, please. So to preempt any questions about aquaculture harvest and wild harvest and sort of where we are today, this is sort of the right when oyster populations and harvests started to pick up again in the early 2000s. This is the public and private oyster harvest combined here in Virginia through 2018. And what you're looking at here is the total public ground harvest, in gray there, the sum of what we would consider traditional harvest or wild private harvest in yellow. So those are oysters caught off private ground with dredges or scrapes or traditional harvest gear. And then aquaculture. So those are the oysters that are produced through hatcheries and grown in cages. So you can see it's a roughly 40-40-20 split, at least in recent times, in terms of where oysters are coming from in Virginia, with private ground being about 40% if it's traditionally caught and basically wild based, so dependent on shell planting and natural recruitment. Public ground, another 40%, and then that containerized floats, cages, that folks think of when they think of private aquaculture still just makes up about 20% of Virginia's harvest, which is all told the largest on the East Coast. Next slide, please. So one of the things that makes oysters unique from other bivalves is, unlike mussels or clams, although mussels do depend on a fish host, oysters really need one thing other than enough broodstock in the water to maintain their population. That's hard substrate. So preferably, oysters like to attach to more oysters. So the reef structure itself is really just a combination of all the dead relatives of oysters past with a sort of thin layer, a couple inches really, of live oysters growing on the surface. So what we do today and what we've been doing since 1929 is basically adding hard substrate to areas where oysters had exist or still exist in some quantity to sort of actually allow physical space for new oysters to attach to. And what you're looking at there is about 60,000 or so bushels of oyster shell being planted. And we plant on anywhere from 500,000 to 700,000 bushels of shell a year to maintain sort of a network of sanctuary and harvest areas. And this is planted in about 4 hours or so. So that's the scale that VMRC works at. Next slide, please. Sort of the science behind that is relatively straightforward. This is a little bit of a busy graphic, but what you're seeing there at the bottom is liters of shell per square meter. And what you're seeing on the other axis there is the number of spat per square meter. And basically, if you physically don't have enough room, which is about 5 liters of shell, which is sort of a very thin layer of shell on the bottom, there just physically isn't enough room for the free floating oyster larva to physically attach to. So they float around for about 2 weeks after spawning. And then they grow a little sort of sticky foot and they look for a hard substrate to attach to, usually an oyster shell, and they stick right there. And really at about 10 liters of shell, which is just about 1 oyster shell thick in a square meter, there's just enough room for them to attach to. And if we maintain our oyster grounds or our sanctuary areas at that, then you get high natural recruitment. And if it drops below that, then basically that rock gradually degrades and goes away because there's just physically not enough room for oysters to attach to. And all of the stormwater issues and sedimentation and poor water quality that it can impact stuff up the watershed can cover up this shell, degrade it, and make it disappear quicker. And the result is less oysters. Next slide, please. So again, sort of where oysters are harvested and where sanctuaries are, that's a little bit different than Maryland and Virginia, is we have each year roughly 75,000 acres are open to harvest. We have harvest rotations. So in a full cycle of that 200 or so acres of 240,000 acres of bay bottom, about 125,000 acres are open during a full rotation cycle over 3 years. So the rest of it doesn't necessarily have lots of oysters, but is effectively sanctuary areas or closed harvest areas. Next slide, please. All of the major oyster restoration projects and most of the productive oyster reefs that in the state, again, are monitored annually by VMRC and the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, and those encompass about 10,000 acres. Next slide there. Which brings us again, sort of taking a step through history. We had the first large-scale replenishment in the 1930s, followed by the 1960s effort. And starting in about 2006 timeframe, or up to that period, is sort of the third restoration wave, I would call it. And this was sort of smaller scale restoration. So it was still widespread, but each of those sites on this map that you're seeing is a restoration project that was about 1 to 2 acres. Next slide, please. And the belief at the time was you had to create these 3-dimensional reefs that we saw in pre-colonial times. So a lot more shells were used to create these reefs. The adaptive management approach, we've learned that you don't necessarily need to make these intertidal reefs. There's a certain sort of reef height that's ideal, but you don't necessarily have to have that level of planting to be successful. Some of the reefs that were built at this height 20 years ago are still there, and some of them that were built in less than ideal locations have almost completely disappeared. So we've learned a lot since then. Next slide. Which brings us to the large-scale restoration efforts that are underway today. So folks may have heard about the 2014 Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement. So under that, there's a goal of restoring 10 tributaries in the bay by 2025, 5 in Virginia and 5 in Maryland. I just have the Virginia tributaries listed here. But the restoration going on today is a little bit different. It's a much larger scale. So instead of having these very diverse small scale projects, they're much more focused in a single tributary and much larger. So the restoration projects going on today are in the hundreds of acres of range in sort of these distinct tributaries, as opposed to a couple acres in range. And a lot of the work being done is now being done with alternative substrates, primarily crushed stone, in some cases artificial structures, reef structures, and crushed concrete. And the irony isn't lost on me that part of the issue with where we are in the oyster fishery today resulted from basically mining our oyster reefs for road beds in the 1930s and earlier. And today we're importing rock, which is primarily used to road beds from the quarries in the mountains to restore oyster reefs. So it used to be that oyster shells were much more plentiful and rocks were too expensive. And now sort of 100 years later, it's the reverse, that there's more rocks available than there are oyster shells. So there's been a little bit of a switch. Next slide, please. So again, the restoration of the past was more focused on direct support for fisheries. So basically oysters for oyster's sake. And restoration today has that still in mind. So there's still a large scale replenishment program run by the Marine Resources Commission to support the fishery, but also with our federal partners at NOAA and Army Corps of Engineers, there's a lot of restoration that's primarily focused for the ecological benefits today. So all the habitat, the water quality benefits, oysters being a keystone species are important to a lot of other species there. So that in combination with our support of the fisheries and our private oyster ground in Virginia is sort of a three-legged stool of what oysters are doing. And oysters, regardless of where they are good for water quality and provide habitat. And oyster larvae don't stay put. So if there's lots of oysters on a sanctuary reef, they end up on private ground and vice versa from harvest areas and private ground back and forth. So I try to never say no to more oysters and try to never say no to more funding for oysters. But as long as we keep that up, hopefully we keep on track to maybe get back to where oysters are creating a navigation hazard again. But again, all that work that's getting done up the watershed is going to help with the oyster restoration effort. Unfortunately, the oyster restoration effort might not necessarily directly help with the work up the watershed, but if we can hold up ourselves as an example of why that good work should continue, whether it's stormwater management or mussel restoration, we're all kind of in it together in that 64,000 square mile watershed that we saw. So with that, I'll go to the next slide and show you that today, oyster reefs are still, in some cases, posing a navigation hazard. So again, this is those seaside oyster rocks there. So hopefully one day you might see that. Unfortunately, you might see that in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, but I don't know if it'll be in our lifetimes. But if we're successful, you might well see that in 40 feet of water as opposed to 3. So thanks for your time and be glad to look for any questions.
Thank you, Andrew. And now we're going to go ahead and look at our Q&A. So Jorge, I'm going to go back to you quickly. And one of our audience members wanted to know if the lure strategy that mussels use is used by all 8 of the species that you said are in the Anacostia watershed.
Yeah, great question. So again, these mussels belong to the Unionid family, and only a subgroup, the Lampsilines, have that capability. In the case of our 8 species, only 2 of them are known to have a mantle lure display. The one that I showed, the lamp mussel, is like the coolest one because it looks like a minnow. The Easter pond mussel does have a mantle lure display, but it does look like they kind of move. It looks like they move it so that it sort of gives the impression of a light, sort of like a neon light, but it's actually the little tissue that they just move very fast, but it looks like a little light. It's pretty cool as well, but not as cool as the fake minnow.
Great, thank you. And one other question for you, Jorge. Someone wanted to know if there's a project similar to yours in Oregon that you know of. They're curious about the mussel bed health and research efforts looking into why they aren't reproducing.
Yeah, I know that the Xerces Society with XERCES, the Xerces Society, has been doing work there, but I don't know of a specific. I've read that even in there's some Native American communities being involved. So yeah, the short answer is yeah, there's some efforts going on, but I don't know specifically. So maybe the the Xerxes Society website might be the best place to go for that.
Great, thank you. And I'll add that all of the resources mentioned throughout the webinar, as well as some additional ones, will be sent out to all of the attendees. And I'm realizing I should add the Anacostia Watershed Society has some great videos of mussels putting on these displays. So we'll be sure to send that to everyone. And Andrew, I have a question for you. Baylor grounds looked mostly absent from the western side of the Delmarva compared with the other side of the Chesapeake. Can you talk more about that and say why that is?
Sure. So if you want, you could maybe go back to one of those slides with the map on it, but keep one more. There you go. Oh, yeah, that's the one. So really, these are maps that were made in the 1890s. So it's possible that there was, prior to that, some more oyster ground in sort of the main stem of the bay there, but a lot of that is sort of deeper water and less suitable habitat, even historically. So basically, that really oysters didn't exist for basically habitat suitability factors there for at least going back to when these areas were initially surveyed. So a lot of the tributaries on the western shore proper are much larger. So you had a lot more oyster habitat that was suitable in those areas. And most of the oyster reefs were actually on the seaside of the eastern shore. And you do see some small areas in those eastern shore creeks on the western side of the Delmarva Peninsula. But most of the productive oyster ground is sort of further up and covered up in those letters, which is actually a pretty considerable area in the Tangier and Pocomoke Sound. So that's where most of the oyster ground is focused on the western shore. Hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you for that. And Andrew, one more question for you. What is the status of public knowledge on oyster importance and recovery? Is it a battle to get it known, or is this info widespread?
Well, I guess with most of the people I talk to on a day-to-day basis, they know about it. But no, it is one of those things that, particularly with a state agency, is we don't necessarily do the best job of putting out what we do every single year. We're a relatively small agency, and we might not have the same messaging. So it's definitely not perhaps as widespread knowledge as it should be in terms of all the good work that's been going on there and the importance of it. But it is something that I hope talks like this and the work that various folks who have communication teams are able to put out, and we're glad to participate in it. And I'm hopeful that webinars like this and other efforts help get the word out. So I appreciate the question, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here and tell folks a little bit more about it.
Thank you. And we're definitely appreciative of both of you joining and sharing all of this knowledge. Jorge, I would also direct that question to you. How much do you think people know about mussel restoration, and do we need to get more of that information out there, and do people need to be more engaged?
Yeah, in the case of the mussels, because it's not like a fishery like the oysters, has been even perhaps more challenging because they're out of sight, out of mind type thing, and also the propagation really has evolved recently in the last decade. When folks like the Virginia Tech has been one of the pioneering universities developing this work, started doing that type of work, but it gets to a point that we know enough that groups like us, Anacostia Watershed Society, a nonprofit, can do it. And so we're actually excited to be one of the first nonprofit organizations to do it, because so far it's been mostly in the academia and government sectors. But yeah, we need more people, and we need a basic knowledge. People, for example, think that we have oysters, not mussels, in the Anacostia River. Whenever I take live mussels or shells to an event, people are amazed to know that we have mussels. Most people have no idea about that. So really, that's where education starts. And then most on the hands-on work, we really need more people. That's the reality, because not a lot of people are doing this. And when I'm talking about mussel surveys, mussel propagation at all levels, we need more people doing this type of work.
Great, thank you. And two more questions. The first one I will say, someone asked if mussels and oysters go well with eelgrass. So do you see eelgrass restoration playing a part in the work that you do?
I guess I can take that one there. So there has been a pretty extensive eelgrass restoration effort, particularly on the seaside eastern shore areas there. So VMRC and the Virginia Institute of Marine Science and the Nature Conservancy have had a long-running partnership on eelgrass restoration, along with, of course, our federal partners, NOAA there. And a lot of those projects had adjacent oyster reef restoration. So a lot of those little triangles that you saw. And what we have seen is that, they don't have to be mutually exclusive of each other. And, eelgrass helps with, sediment control, water clarity, and oysters do a lot of the same things, as well as deposit sort of pseudofeces. So there are some papers coming out now that are sort of being published that are saying that oysters and eelgrass, or SAV in general, tend to have benefits to each other. So, it's one of those things that in any natural environment, the more changes you have in terms of habitat, whether it's forest edge, meadow, that sort of thing, or oyster reef, eelgrass, sand flat, mud flat, basically more variation in a habitat generally is a healthier ecosystem. And both oysters and eelgrass are considered sort of keystone species in the bay. So again, I try to never say no to more oysters or more eelgrass. So hopefully that both efforts continue and have benefits to each other.
So yeah, I guess eelgrass is the Zostera marina. We don't quite have that in the Anacostia. We have other species. We actually used to propagate Vallisneria americana, the wild celery, which is more common on these reaches of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And yes, where there's SAV beds, there's mussels. So yeah, it can be a good habitat for mussels. And if you think about it, yes, a lot of fish hang out there, and those are their host fishes. So yeah, it is, SAV is a good thing for mussels. And actually, some folks at the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary are considering approaches to living shorelines that include wetlands, underwater grasses, and mussels in one approach. It's still at the conceptual. I don't think they have implemented any project on the ground, but it's a really cool idea that they are developing there.
I guess it might give some of those eels a home there, refuge from other predators if they're hiding out in the eelgrass on their way up to collect some mussels in their gills as they work their way up the watershed.
Yep.
Great, thank you. And Jorge, someone also wanted to know if you know of any similar programs to what you do that are on the James River.
On the James River, yes, because actually the Harrison Lake Hatchery is located right by the James River. So I know they have helped with propagation efforts, and that's one of the places they monitor, and they collect broodstock for propagation. So yeah, the Harrison Lake Hatchery definitely is, they do work there.
All right, thank you both so much. That wraps up our Q&A. As I said, we will be sharing this presentation on YouTube, so it will be accessible to everyone, and everyone who registered will also get all of the resources with links to Andrew's work and Jorge's work as well. So we thank you all for joining us today. Thank you so much to our speakers for everything you do and for taking time out of your schedules to share this information. And we're getting some comments in the Q&A also thanking you for what you've shared today. So we hope to see a lot more on all of these projects and the health of our oyster and mussel beds. And thank you everyone for joining today.
Thank you.
Thank you.